We're here to talk about the catalyst of change. Last week we talked about life on other planets, and the point of these lectures is really to talk about some of the most important scientific endeavors that are going on that will change the way that we live. So last week we talked about life on other planets and actually how life came about to some extent, and tonight we'll talk about the fast-changing biosphere. So we have a really interesting lecture discussing what's happening to our current biosphere, how we can what the impact of that's going to be on our lives in the future, and also perhaps ways that we can actually have impact on it so that some of the maybe more dire impacts won't happen. The lecture originally was meant to continue our experiment with having two lecturers. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Rachel Gallery won't be doing it. So Brian Enquist, who I'll discuss in a second, has gallantly said that he's going to take on this endeavor for us tonight. Brian Enquist is a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology here at the University of Arizona, and he's broadly trained as both an ecologist and a botanist. His lab investigates how climate influences the physiology and functioning of plants. He has over 200 scientific papers, that's quite a bit, and over 35,000 citations, meaning somebody else thought his work was very important. He recently published an article just this week, in fact, on the importance of large animals, and you'll see that in part of his discussion. It was published in Nature Communications, which is very prestigious in itself. I could be here all night talking about his awards, but I'll just mention two. He won a Fulbright Scholarship and was named one of Popular Science's most brilliant 10 young scientists, which is quite an honor. And he is also a fellow of the Ecological Society of America and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So please join me in welcoming Brian Enquist.
Great. Thank you, Elliot. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Is this on? Is this on? Yes, okay. Thank you very much, Elliot. I just want to just take a moment and to thank the College of Science and to thank Elliot and the staff of the College of Science for organizing this tremendous series. Not only is this a wonderful venue to share the importance of science in society, but also to kind of highlight just the amazing research that occurs here at the University of Arizona. So thank you to the College of Science for this. Okay, so to get started, I'm going to talk about the future of the biosphere. So by training, I'm a biologist. In particular, my specialties are in botany. I study plants, but I'm also an ecologist. And it's tough being an ecologist in the world today. And to pull out a quote from Aldo Leopold in the Sand County Almanac, one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Much of the damage that is inflicted in the land is quite invisible to laymen. I'm just going to give you one example. Did you know that we're now at the end of the decade on biodiversity? The United Nations implemented in 2010 a decade to study the importance of biodiversity on the planet. The importance of biodiversity not in terms of just biology, but the importance of biodiversity to our society and to the Earth, and in particular, the biosphere. Now, we're going to be talking about a lot of different terms, and it's always good when we start class to start with some definitions, in particular, biodiversity. So biodiversity is a term that we use to describe the variety and variability of life on Earth. And we apply our understanding of biodiversity at all different levels of biological organization, from the smallest scale, from within the soil, and talk about microbes, all the way up to communities and ecosystems, and at the highest scale, something that we call the biosphere. Now, we can characterize biological diversity, biodiversity, in terms of number of species, different types of species, but also differences in how those species function. That is, the different roles that they play on the planet. And we can also characterize their relatedness to each other. Now, the biosphere is a term that we use to describe the living skin of the planet. And you likely have heard of our other spheres on the world, right? So we have the atmosphere, the lithosphere, the world of rocks, the hydrosphere. And you've probably heard a lot about climate change and how we're changing the atmosphere. And climate change is also changing the hydrosphere, changing the acidity of the oceans, the temperature of the oceans. But you probably haven't heard how climate change is changing our biosphere. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. Now, in order to kind of convey the work that I'm going to talk about, we have to kind of come up with some kind of common metrics. And one of the metrics that we use to connect aspects of biodiversity with the biosphere is something known as metabolism, something actually you're doing right now, sitting there in your chair. Now, metabolism is something that all living things do. Metabolism is the set of chemical reactions within organisms, within your cells, that's basically powering you. Okay? And we measure metabolism in terms of energy. So metabolism is energy. It's the ability then of life to do work. This talk is also about something known as the Great Acceleration. So acceleration, increasing speed. The changes that we're going through now are not only obvious changes, but they're accelerating changes, and they're going to continue to accelerate. This acceleration ultimately is due to the success of humanity and humanity across the planet at large. Now, this acceleration started in the mid-20th century, and it continues to this day. In this talk, I'm going to be focusing on 4 aspects of the Great Acceleration. But I'm going to focus on how this Great Acceleration is influencing our biosphere. First aspect is metabolism, our common measure that's going to allow us to assess future worlds, what our biosphere may look like in the future. The second, I'm going to be focusing on aspects of climate and climate change, but in particular, how metabolism and climate change is influencing species on the planet and also the response of ecosystems on the planet. And to do that, we're going to be focusing also on biodiversity, how biodiversity then is going to be changing. And lastly, what's going to be happening to our biosphere. And I'm going to be focusing on something known as the mega biota, the largest plants and animals on the planet. So we're now living in an era known as the Anthropocene, the increasing human domination of the planet. We can characterize the Anthropocene as something known as the Great Acceleration. And I can characterize this Great Acceleration in a series of different graphs. So let's look at several different measures of human activity on the planet going back about 250 years. And here are all the graphs. On the x-axis is years going back to the 1700s to present day, and the y-axis is a change in something associated with humanity on the planet. Population has increased. The gross domestic product, our economy, has increased. Rates of investment, how much energy we use on the planet, the amount of fertilizer that we use on the planet, how much water is needed, how much paper is produced, our rates of transportation, telecommunications, and the rise of international tourism. Now, if you look at these curves, they all have the same shape. Accelerating change. It's not stopping. And that acceleration is not just in human systems. That impact is on the planet and our planetary systems. So if we look at Earth system trends, carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, nitrous oxide, methane, ozone levels, the surface temperature is increasing. The oceans are getting more acidic. The harvesting of fish, the loss of tropical forest, how much land on the planet is used for agriculture, the overall degradation of the biosphere, all accelerating. This acceleration really started to ramp up around 1950, approximately. So metabolism. All right, so this is a class, right? I can ask you questions. I expect a response. What is driving this acceleration? What underlies this acceleration? Anybody? Very good. The number of people. But that's partial credit. What else? Technology. The what? All right, we're going to have to go to the introductory lecture on this one. I heard a little bit, partial credit. It's your per capita metabolic demand, okay? It's the number of people times the demand per person. Now we can make this a little bit more complicated. If we're going to keep this in metabolic units, energy units, we can parse out our per capita metabolic demand in terms of how much energy it costs you to keep your biology alive, right? Basically how much you have to ingest a day to keep your metabolism going, times what we're going to call our extended metabolism, basically to keep you happy and here, right? Our way of living. So, biological metabolism and extended metabolism. Okay. In biology, we can characterize the variation in metabolism by something known as Kleiber's law, actually named after Max Kleiber, American animal physiologist, here in 1938. And actually, this graph is Kleiber's original publication from 1938. We would probably plot things a little differently now. But what this relationship shows is that if you go from the smallest organisms up to the largest organisms, there is a very simple mathematical relationship that describes your biological and metabolic needs. That is, as you go from small things to big things just require more energy. They have more cells, they're bigger, they eat more. You have a bigger dog, you feed the dog more dog food, right? But we can characterize that mathematically. And if you notice, on this graph from Kleiber, we have a man and a woman, okay? And it turns out that your metabolic rate is approximately 100 watts. That's what you need to live and survive, 100 watts. And so to give you an idea, this is the old light bulb, right? 60 watts. This is the one, unlike the LEDs that make you look orange, apparently. Here's you, 120 watts. Each one of you, 120 watts, glowing in the audience. Okay. So, next question. Where does all that energy come from? Very good. The sun. That powers you. And here's the chemical equation for that reaction. How that energy gets to you is through plants, photosynthesis. That is powering everything on the biosphere. But in order for photosynthesis to proceed, carbon dioxide, remember, comes into the plant via photosynthesis. Plants create sugar with that carbon, but to do that process takes a little bit of energy, okay? And we can calculate what that is. So that's how much energy then is happening associated with photosynthesis, about 39 kilojoules per gram of carbon. Now that's at one scale, the leaf. We can also measure now photosynthesis on the scale of a planet. Thanks to remote sensing, satellite data, we can now measure the metabolism of the biosphere. And this is the metabolism of the Earth right here, in terms of photosynthesis in the oceans, in aquatic landscapes, but also in the terrestrial environment. And as you can see, this is a dynamic Earth. We have the advancement of snow in the winter, retreat of snow during the summer, but we can then see basically this breathing dynamic biosphere associated with the seasonality of the Earth. We can also show the metabolism of the Earth a little bit differently. to give you a new view of metabolism. And what we can do is estimate exactly how much energy is being passed through the biosphere through metabolism. And it turns out that the energy flow through the land is about 150 terawatts, which is 150 million watts. And here's the energy flow through the ocean, about 120 million watts, 120 terawatts. And so that the total energy flow through the Earth is 270 terawatts. Right? That's the power of the planet in terms of the planetary metabolism. Now, let's rescale that metabolism in terms of the intensity of that metabolism. So we're rescaling the planet of metabolism based on the total amount that's being produced at a given time. And so you can see that the tropical areas are kind of exaggerated, they're bloated out, because that's where a lot of terrestrial photosynthesis then is occurring. And during the winter time, the temperate zones, well, it's winter, there's not a lot of photosynthesis occurring. But now what we can do is that we can animate this proportional aspect of metabolism through time. This is the beating of the heart of the world, the biosphere. Okay? It's a living entity. So during the wintertime, the temperate zones perform a lot of photosynthesis, and they go dormant during the winter. Okay. So, ultimately, everything that you do is fueled by this metabolism. The energy flow through our metabolism describes our ability to change the world around us. Human metabolism is embedded within this planetary metabolism. There's no escaping it. So how does the metabolism of humanity compare with metabolism of the rest of the biosphere? So I'm going to make a simple plot. I'm going to show on the x-axis the energy use per individual versus the energy use per unit area. And this is actually work that's done by a brilliant researcher here, Robbie Berger at the University of Arizona. And so what Robbie did was he asked, well, what if we look at all the mammals on the planet and ask, where do they fall? And that's where all the mammals fall. So if you think about all the different types of mammals then on the planet, you can see that there's variability in the energy use per individual, but also the energy use per unit area. Up above, we have a yellow dotted line here. That's the average metabolism of the biosphere per unit area. That's the global average. So in general, mammals across the planet are using less energy per unit area, right? Which makes sense because there's only so much of food available, almost so much energy available per unit area. And so they're always lower than that because the world can't supply increased densities of mammals. Now we can also put people on here. Here's our best estimate of the metabolism of hunter-gatherers in terms of their not only biological metabolism, the 120 watts per person, but the extended metabolism. That is, how much energy then is required in order to support then these early societies. About 300 watts. We can now speed up time to pre-industrial humanity. We require more things. We have technology. We require beasts of burden, horses, cattle, then in order to support then our own societies. And if we then measure that extended metabolism then required to support pre-industrial humanity, we're now up to about 2,000 watts, again, in addition to the 120 watts of your biological metabolism. So our extended metabolism is now growing. What about today? What if we measure your extended metabolism? What energy is needed to basically satisfy your daily lives? Here's humanity today. Extended metabolism on average about 8,000 watts. We have now surpassed the global average net primary productivity. We've crossed a planetary boundary. If we graph going from present day, okay, all the way back in total 16,000 years, and plot the social metabolism, watts per person, we see a gradual increase, a little warp and wiggle there because of the Black Death, right? Pestilence, rise of modern society, science, modern medicine, an explosion of social metabolism. So what's fueling that rise? Ancient photosynthesis is fueling that rise. So if we go back 200, 300 million years ago, the planet looked like this. All of that carbon stored in these ancient tree trunks fell in these anoxic environments, was buried over time, got deposited, all that ancient CO2 deposited, put away inside the earth, coal, oil. Ancient photosynthesis. That is fueling the Great Acceleration. So here is an animation showing the rise of industry across the planet in terms of the annual CO2 emissions starting in the year 1751, starting with the origin then of the industrial, our modern industrial society in the UK, and we're going to animate this forward, and what you're going to see is our industrial, our extended metabolism light up, fueling humanity's growth. Notice there's still large parts of the planet that still haven't lit up yet, but they will. Okay. So let's go back to Kleiber's law. Can we help use this law to make sense of the change around us? Well, we can take a few organisms you may be familiar with, going from a dog to a rhino all the way to an elephant. Now, let's put these different human societies, people from hunter-gatherers all the way up to modern society, and instead of looking at their biological metabolism, let's look at their extended metabolism. So if we were a mammal with the metabolic impact of our social metabolism, how big would we be? The average industrial human has the resource consumption of a 15 metric ton primate. In North America, even bigger, 30 metric tons. For those of you trying to do some quick visualizations of what that would look like, it's this. Each of you, King Kongs, sitting in your seat, roaming around the world. Okay. So, let's switch gears. How are species and ecosystems responding to climate change? Now, this is a big, important, complicated question and issue, and we're doing our best to address this, but we've learned a few things. So, what is going to be the impact of this great acceleration on the planet? Could be a traumatic train wreck, right? A big calamity. Here's my favorite train wreck. 22nd of October, 1895. The driver was late getting into the station. Decided to kind of put, the pedal to the metal, increase the speed, entered the train station going way too fast, put on the brake way too late, hit a series of barriers. The barriers did not stop the train. It kept going all the way through the station and out to the street below. Okay. Planetary boundaries. All right. The train is rapidly coming into the station. if we look at humanity's influence on planetary processes going back over 10 million years, we see this gradual increase in terms of the impact of humans on the planet. And we can measure then that in various different ways, and we can mark it with differences in technology and so on. Now, what's going to be the future impact? And this is where choices come in. We have several different choices, the different futures that we want to live in. And this is not a far-off future. You, sitting here, will actually start to experience some of these futures. Your children will experience these futures, and their children's children are definitely going to experience these futures. And it's up to us to decide which future biosphere we want to live in. So are we entering a safe Anthropocene, or are we going to totally rupture and surpass all of the limits? Okay, so here are our choices. It's actually this easy. We have two different worlds to choose from. Temperatures are going to change. That's going to be baked in. But we can decide which rate of change we're going to enter in. We call this either the best case scenario or the worst case scenario. These are the future global temperatures in approximately 100 years. This is now, I put this in Fahrenheit because oftentimes people have a hard time here in this country with Celsius. A world where we're seeing increases, I don't know, maybe 3-5 degrees Fahrenheit change, best case scenario, or a world where we're talking about changes 9-15 degrees Fahrenheit changes. And then that's just the mean. This isn't showing the extreme temperature changes. Choose your temperature. So we're now entering in what is known as the Anthropocene. It means different things to different people. It could mean an Earth system where humanity is bouncing against and rupturing planetary boundaries. Could also be a distant event in Earth, a distinct event in Earth's history recorded in the rock record, the stratigraphic record. It's a modern world where human influence is pervasive. It's a world after nature, where the natural no longer exists. All of Earth history touched by human activity. So given then the Anthropocene, given the acceleration of these changes, can we predict the future of the biosphere? We know what's going to happen to the atmosphere. We know what's going to happen to the oceans. But what about the living aspect of the planet? So it could be that Huxley, instead of writing The Brave New World, should have written Brave New Biosphere. Okay, so how do we envision these potential scenarios of the future of the biosphere? Well, on the left-hand side, we have one part of the hourglass. On the right-hand side, we have a future part of the hourglass. The left-hand side is the world that humanity grew up in, the biosphere that humanity basically evolved in. That's in the past. There's going to be a bottleneck constricted by resources available to other living things, area available to preserve living things, and all of the biosphere is going to go through this bottleneck, and what comes out on the other side is going to be influenced by our decisions. We can influence the size of this bottleneck in terms of what passes from the past into the future by noting what the pressures are, constricting what makes it into the future, but also our responses, the way we manage the world, our decisions then that we make, will influence what progresses from the past into the future. So here at the University of Arizona, there are an impressive number of researchers working on this question right now in terms of not only what our current status of the biosphere is, but also what the future of the biosphere is going to be. So we have groups known as the Bridging Biodiversity and Conservation Science. This is an interdisciplinary cross-college initiative, kind of a rapid response team to bring together people from medicine, from ecology, from the School of Natural Resources to all focus on some of these pressing problems. There's a lot of expertise here at the University of Arizona, increasingly focused on big data. Right? We have a lot of information now coming from satellites, from natural history collections about biodiversity and how our world is changing in terms of the biosphere. But we also have a lot of theoretical work going on in terms of kind of trying to figure out and predict what's going to happen in the future, both in terms of developing mathematical models, but also computer simulation models to figure out our best understanding in terms of predicting and forecasting what the future of the biosphere is going to be. So I want to highlight a little bit of this work to give you a sense of the work that's currently going on. And I want to start with kind of maybe a simple example, but maybe something that maybe is more familiar. So I want to focus actually on one species of tree, subalpine fir. So if you go to some of the highest mountaintops here in Arizona, or if you go into Colorado, throughout the West, you'll see this tree, beautiful tree. And it's distributed, and here's the geographic range map of where you'll find subalpine fir throughout the West, and here's its current distribution. Now what we can do is that we can take a lot of the information about changes in climate, changes in temperature, and the pace at which that's changing, and we can take information about the physiology then of this tree. We also can have information about where it tends to occur to make some good educated guess in terms of where it likely will be in the future, or could be in the future. So we can design then these animations that are going through at 10-year time steps. 10-year time steps. And so what I'm showing you is the change in the suitability of the climate for subalpine fir, just one species. Now, unfortunately, subalpine fir just can't get up and walk and move. And what you'll see, and this is the same for many species that we look at, a changing distribution, quite rapid changing distribution. For subalpine fir, the future does not look good, especially in the West. But what we can do is I can give you how subalpine fir, its distribution will change on the blue line according to the best case scenario of our emissions, or the red line, the worst case scenario. I can tell you approximately how much forest area you may or may not lose according to these different choices that we may make. We can do the same for another species. In general, if you like trees, we like aspen trees. Beautiful. And what a better place to study what will happen to aspen than in the town of Aspen, Colorado, named for the wonderful aspen trees. So I'm going to show you a map here. There's another different way of visualizing how the change in the climate suitability of aspen is going to change on very short ecological timescales. And so what we can see here is a map. You can see the mountains with snow on it, but you see this dark green, these dark green areas right here. That's where we expect the climate for aspen currently to be best. And in general, it works pretty well. You go to those areas, you tend to see aspen trees. But what we can do is that we can also kind of animate, and I can go back and forth, how the distribution, the climate distribution of aspen may change under the best case climate scenario. But I can also show you what the town of Aspen will look like under the worst case scenario. We're not expecting aspen trees to survive in Aspen, Colorado. Now, we can do this for many different species. It gives us a back-of-the-envelope way of approximating not only the rate of change, but the types of different change we may see under the blue line, the best-case scenario, and the red line, the worst-case scenario. So we can give you this choice. Do you want to lose approximately 40% of your forested area of Colorado, or 10%? It's up to you. So biodiversity. So how do we protect threatened species and ecosystems? This is a daunting challenge. a rapidly, more increasingly dire challenge. So, how we used to do conservation biology has totally changed. We used to design conservation areas and our protected areas as if species were kind of, always going to be on the landscape. And the only changes were, land clearing and humans. But now species are on the move. It's not a static world, it's a dynamically changing world. And I'm going to show you an animation that starts in the year 1700. And this is for South America, and there's going to be 3 different colors here. The red areas are developing areas, okay? So if we go back to the 1700s and we map out where people tended to be, where their agriculture was, but then the blacker areas, more urbanized environments, high densities than of people. But then there's going to be another color that comes up, and that's the yellow areas. The yellow areas are the protected areas, things like national parks or areas set aside for biodiversity management that could have people or not. These are areas then dedicated to the preservation of nature. So let's watch this movie. So you'll see the slow progression of areas then dominated by humans, and the rapid proliferation, relatively recently, of protected areas. And I think what you understand is now the world is effectively full. This is a complicated graph, but it's actually very easy if I walk you through it. On the x-axis is time in years, going back from 1900 to present day, but also out to the year 2100. And there's 2 curves. There's a curve on the top that's angled down, and there's a curve on the bottom going up. And there's kind of different flavors of the curves based on different ways we estimate. The curve on the bottom is the rise in areas under conservation in some sort of way, protected areas. The curve on the top is the area of land then that is potentially available for conservation that's not being impacted then by people in terms of our agriculture or urban environments. And I think what you'll notice is that those 2 curves are going to intersect. And when they intersect, that means all of the land on Earth is accounted for. And we estimate that crossing of those 2 curves is going to occur sometime around 2050. We call this the last call for protected areas. We have a closing window of opportunity in order to protect nature and to anticipate the areas important for nature. Some of you may know of the famous biologist E.O. Wilson. He has a recent book known as Half Earth. He has argued that in order to maintain the integrity of biodiversity and the functioning of the biosphere, we need 50% of Earth preserved for nature. Well, we crossed that line, depending on how you estimate it, either shortly after 1950 or sometime around 2000. 50% of Earth is now past. We're now trying to get to 30%. So how we do conservation now has totally changed. So why is this important? Species are and will be on the move. We need to anticipate and prioritize key areas where they're going to be moving so that by the time we get to 2050, 2070, maybe at the latest, this is our last call. So rapid changes in biodiversity is going to have cascading impacts. So in our planetary history, Earth history, we've had several mass extinctions, usually precipitated by a large asteroid or something cataclysmic. A big debate now is if we're actually in the 6th mass extinction. We know, if we look across different groups of animals and plants, currently, there's a significant fraction of species that are currently endangered or threatened with extinction, if we look across birds, mammals, amphibians. Now, how we impact the probability of a species going extinct is complicated due to many different factors. Changes in land use and agriculture, differences in kind of the rise of new technologies, differences in hunting pressures, kind of complex kind of interconnections with our global economic markets and differing demands, from society, but also changes in regional and planetary boundaries. So one of the best predictors of extinction that we know of is actually something simple: how many individuals there are. So something is endangered or at risk of extinction if the numbers of individuals get really, really small. Okay? That's an easy way to identify if something is going to go extinct. Well, there's not too many of them. This is one of my favorite botanists. This is Steve Perlman. He's kind of the Indiana Jones of botany. So here he is rappelling off these steep cliffs in Hawaii, looking for these rare and threatened endangered plants that have somehow managed to survive a lot of the changes going on in Hawaii by kind of clinging to these cliffs kind of off the side. And so here he is collecting one of the few seeds from one of the few remaining species of orchids. This is very important work. It's very tough work. But how can we speed this effort to identify what is potentially risk of extinction? How can we rapidly identify all of the Earth species in risk of extinction? Can we maybe identify some shortcuts, maybe first find where are areas of the planet that are hotspots of extinction? So here at the University of Arizona, we've been compiling all the world's biodiversity data, everything that we know about the locations of all different species on the planet. And so we wanted to focus on an important group, plants, photosynthesis, remember? And so here, for this data set that we assembled, we're over 200 million observations of plants across the globe. And with this, we actually identified the total number of plants on the planet in terms of species. We estimate about 435,000 plant species across the planet. Now, when we look at the aspects of biodiversity, the flavor of biodiversity in terms of rarity and commonness, and if we plot the number of observations per species and look at the frequency of observations per species, you'll get this inverse curve. And what that is saying is that very few species have been observed a lot of times. These are the really common things. But there are very few species that are very common. Most of the species are actually very rare. And it turns out about 36% of all plant species have only been observed in our data sets 5 times. That's amazing. We know very little about a large majority of species. So most species are very rare, which means a large fraction of species are in potential danger of extinction. Now, we can ask, where are these rare species? Well, what we identify in these maps here, where they're highlighted in kind of increasingly more orange and brown color, these are what we call hotspots of rarity. These are locations on the planet, like the Andes, the fynboths in South America, Madagascar, Southeast China, New Guinea. These are areas that have a disproportionate number of rare species, areas that maybe we can quickly target in terms of our conservation effort. But we also asked, well, why are there a lot of rare species here to begin with? Why do we find them in these areas? And it turns out, and this is really interesting and quite important, is that these are the areas of the planet that have been climatically stable over the last 20,000 years. These are the areas of the planet that have had the most stable climate through that time. So you can think of these areas as kind of being able to protect these rare things. Now, when we look into the future and ask, what about the stability of the climate in these places that harbor the rarest species, what we find is very sobering. So what I'm showing you is a heat map. We call it a heat map. The redder the color, the more worse it is, unfortunately. We are forecasting the change in climate then associated then with rarity. And what we find is that in areas that house the most plant species, those areas are going to be experiencing, they're forecast to experience, the fastest rate of change. Okay. So, we can use this information now to identify where should we place protected areas for climate change. So here at the University of Arizona, we're involved in this project with Conservation International and the GEF out of the UN, something known as SPARC, Spatial Planning for Protected Areas in Response to Climate Change. How can we rapidly go out and identify areas of the planet that are changing very quickly, that likely have the highest number of species at risk of extinction? Can we foresee and target things in advance before they happen? So I'll show you just one example. Here we're going out, we're forecasting the climate suitability of a given species. Okay? And as you can see, the climate suitability of a given species, this one species through time, is kind of moving then up the mountain. The green areas, those are protected areas. And you'll see that here, the climate suitability is moving kind of in and then out of the protected area. We can do this for many different species, but then we can also overlay on top of that what we call these tracks or these chains. This is effectively the potential suitable climate movement of different species, right? And we can do this one at a time, and then with massive computation, we can do this hopefully for all species on the planet to look to see and identify where then are these tracks then that species may need, or suitable areas for the most number of species. And we've done that in many different locations. And so here what I'm showing are within one of the biodiversity hotspots, rarity hotspots, the Andes of South America, I'm showing you a density of these total number of chains or tracks of different species. And so the red areas are likely areas that are going to be kind of potentially climatically favorable to a lot of species moving into the future. These would be potential priority areas. Okay. So that's what we're doing at the U of A. And another aspect of research occurring here is trying to assess, well, let's step back and now let's assess the biosphere. And so this is the last point that I want to make today. In particular, what happens on the planet if we lose Earth's largest species? We call these species the megabiota, the largest plants and animals on the planet. And I have to say that I think that this, by far, is going to be the most single important change and long-lasting change that we're doing to the biosphere. Because we disproportionately impact the largest things on the planet. So human activities across the globe has disproportionately hunted and exploited the largest animals and plants. We've lost a lot of giants, a tremendous number of giants that are no longer with us, but were with us in our evolutionary history. So to give you a sense, here's kind of the temporal aspect of this loss. So we're going back years ago, over 100,000 years ago to today, and we're looking across each of the kind of major kind of continents, okay, across the globe, and we're looking at the mean body mass of the animals that used to live in those different environments. And if you notice, starting around 10,000 years ago, we see this precipitous drop. So that happened in the past, and it's continuing to happen now. If we just focus on the most charismatic animals that you know of, elephants, gorillas, cheetahs, leopards, lions, giraffes, polar bears, all of their populations in general are decreasing. They continue to decrease. We haven't lost them yet, but they're nowhere near as abundant as they used to be. So we can estimate, to the best of our ability, how much animal biomass there was about 10,000 years ago. in terms of millions of metric tons. And here it is today. But we can also put on this graph the biomass of humanity and our commensals, cattle, sheep, horses, and so on. And between 1970 and 2010, we've lost 52% of all individuals of animals on the planet. So the population sizes of animals on the planet have been getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, we haven't lost a lot of them, especially the charismatic ones, but there's a lot fewer of them. And what's amazing is that we're still discovering new things in the world. So, for example, just this past year, they discovered in the Amazon, thanks to new satellite technology, the tallest tree in the Amazon, coming in at almost 90 meters. Okay. The story of trees isn't a good one. But now with new technology, we can estimate the distribution then of forests across the planet. And we can map the tree density at global scales. And we can estimate that currently there's about 3 trillion trees on the planet. That's a great number, right? Did you know there are 3 trillion trees on the planet? Right. But it's nowhere near what it used to be. Each year, over 15 billion trees are cut down, every year. And since the start of human civilization, we have lost about 46% of all trees on the planet. But it's not just any tree, it's the largest and the oldest ones. Big and old trees are currently declining anywhere on the planet that you look. And we've tried, we've scoured the literature. Everywhere we're seeing decreases disproportionately in the biggest plants. So why are these big things important? Well, small things are important too, but big things have a disproportionate impact on the biosphere. So these big things have all of these interactions, ecological interactions, right? We have beetles, we have parasites, we have scavengers, we have birds, ectoparasites, we have herbivores and carnivores, and they're all linked together in an ecological web. And so if you pull out these big organisms from this web, it has dramatic cascading changes. And it's the type of change that you don't notice, you don't necessarily see. Because, hey, there's still life out there, right? But if we actually go in and measure the ecological impact in terms of metabolism, it's a very dramatic effect. So how do these large plants and animals influence the functioning of ecosystems and the biosphere? So in 2009, we had an analogous experiment. The Great Recession, mainly caused by the trouble and failure of some of our largest banks and corporations. So what happens to the economy if we take out the biggest bank or pull out the biggest corporation? The largest cities and corporations disproportionately impact the global economy. And the same is true for the economy of nature. So we can update Kleiber's law, and we can now put all these different organisms on Kleiber's law, and we can now estimate, as we change the body sizes of species on the planet, what does that mean for not only individual metabolic demand, but the total biosphere metabolic rate. So why are they important? Big things. So here's a great group of elephants. Elephants travel over long distances, right? And they have a big impact because they may eat in one location. They're herbivores, they eat a lot of grass, a lot of leaves, even wood, right? All that nutrients, all of that food stuff ultimately has to come out the other end. So elephants, large animals, even large trees, they are fertilizers of the planet. They take nutrients in one location and move them and spread them out, And imagine a planet filled with big things spreading their fertilizer over everywhere. So big things provide a lot of benefits. We can talk about benefits for ecological systems and also socioeconomic systems. So our own economy, our human well-being. And so we can measure all of these various different benefits. And it turns out that they provide disproportionate benefits, not only on biodiversity, but also on human well-being. So how do we begin to tackle how the loss then of these largest things in the world is actually impacting the biosphere? Well, we can simulate it. Right? Our computational power now has increased to the fact that we can simulate the entire biosphere with these equations of energy, but also the rules of how species interact with each other and how they compete, fend for themselves, and so on. So this is known as the Mattingly model. It was actually originally put together by Microsoft, and it's now kind of spun off into its own thing. And so here what we're doing in each of these grid cells, we're actually simulating the ecology. We're simulating the growth of plants and how plants interact with the environment, but also how animals then eat plants and then other animals eat other animals. And we put in all these energetic and metabolic rules to produce a simulation of the biosphere. And in this case, we can keep track of the bookkeeping, and we can then do experiments where we reduce the size ranges of animals and plants within the simulation model. And we can ask, all right, what does a biosphere look like in a Pleistocene world, in both temperate and tropical environments? If we move to the modern world, we've lost some of the biggest things. And we can also then expect and forecast a future world, more devoid of animals and plants. And we can ask then what happens to the total biosphere biomass in terms of the heterotrophic, the animal biomass, but also the total heterotrophic metabolism, but also the global nutrient fertility, that is, the regeneration of nutrients and the spread of nutrients across the biosphere, the fertility of the planet. And what we see for all of these different measures is a reduction. And so we estimate that with the continued loss of the largest animals and plants, we're going to see a 44% reduction in heterotrophic biomass, a 17% reduction in the total biosphere metabolism, but a almost 90% reduction in the fertility of the planet, just by losing the big things. So, I've emphasized 4 aspects of the Great Acceleration in terms of their impact then on the biosphere. And these changes are driven ultimately by this Great Acceleration. In particular, our metabolic demand for resources is accelerating, and the impacts of those demands are also accelerating. So we have some choices to make in terms of the future of the biosphere. We're going to be increasingly entering into a bottleneck. Now, we get to choose what makes it to the other side. We can choose the future of our biosphere in terms of understanding and trying to mitigate differing pressures, differences in climate and the rate of climate change, but also how we manage then the world and how we anticipate then these changes. So remember, the math, when you step back at this scale, is kind of simple. It's the number of people and our metabolic demand, and our metabolic demand is huge. So what we've been doing is shrinking the metabolism of the planet, the natural metabolism of the planet. And that has come at the expense of the rise of our own metabolism, so it shouldn't be a surprise. So, to conclude, there's a lot of bad news here. I'm sorry about that. No getting around that, okay? Yeah, these drivers of change in the Anthropocene are rapid. And the scary thing about this change is it's going to be accelerating. It's scary. Now, the aspect of this is the time to act is now to potentially avoid catastrophic changes, because increasingly it's going to be very hard to reverse. But I also want to leave you with this. There's a lot of good news. There really is a lot of good news, because we now can start to foresee what the biosphere will be like, and we can provide quantitative predictions for what the world is going to look like. We can also communicate and now visualize these changes in a way that's understandable on timescales that are understandable for us in our normal day-to-day lives. And despite the enormous complexities, we can start to simplify the problem and start to get good approximations for what we think the magnitude of these potential changes would be. But also with conservation efforts, again, because the way we're doing conservation is now rapidly changing, we can now streamline a lot of conservation efforts by focusing on things like hotspots of rarity, hotspots of extinction, of current and future diversity. But also we can do simple things like try to promote the largest animals and the largest trees because they have such a disproportionate impact. And all of this gives us less guesswork, more focus, and the efficient use of funding. So I want to send out a get well soon to Rachel. Unfortunately couldn't be here. But also to thank a tremendous number of people. Even though it's been me standing up here yammering, a lot of brilliant people I've had the pleasure to work with who are actually behind the majority of this work, as well as the support from many institutions. So thank you.